I was one of them once. Jauline's words echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the marble foyer, sharp and devastating. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the frantic, erratic beating of my own heart. I stared at the woman in the crimson dress, my mind violently rejecting what she was implying. "Shut your mouth, Jauline," Charles snarled. The raw, possessive heat that had completely consumed him at the mountain house was entirely gone. He stepped in front of me, shielding me from her calculating gaze, his heavy pistol still aimed directly at his wife's chest. "You have exactly 5 seconds to tell me how many of Reyes's men are on this property before I put a bullet in you." Jauline didn't even flinch. She let out a soft, mocking laugh, her dark eyes dropping to the polished marble floor before slowly lifting to meet mine, entirely ignoring her husband. "Has he told you the truth yet, little doctor?" Jauline asked, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Or is he still playing the bleeding victim who just happened to stumble into your hidden basement clinic?" "I said shut up," Charles roared, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger. But it was too late. The seed of absolute dread had already taken root in my chest. I looked at Charles's broad, tense back. I remembered the sheer impossibility of the night we met. A mafia boss bleeding out from a cartel ambush, miraculously dragging himself down the forgotten alleyway of the Narrows, directly to the reinforced door of a disgraced surgeon. "Charles?" My voice was a breathless, trembling whisper. "Aunt, what is she talking about?" He didn't look back at me. His massive shoulders were locked in rigid, terrifying tension. That was all the answer I needed. "He didn't stumble into your clinic, Maya," Jauline purred, taking a slow step down the stairs. "He tracked you. He knew exactly who you were. He knew you survived the Reyes Cartel takeover south of the border 3 years ago. He has been watching your little underground operation for over 12 months, waiting for the perfect moment to force you into his debt." The air completely left my lungs. The entire world tilted on its axis. The man who had kissed me by the fire, the man who had promised to protect me, had orchestrated the entire nightmare. "Is it true?" I demanded, my voice cracking as I stepped out from behind his massive frame. I ignored the gun in his hand. And I ignored the cartel threat. I walked right into his line of sight, forcing him to look at me. "Tell me it's a lie, Charles. Tell me you didn't know who I was." Charles finally lowered the weapon. He looked down at me, the dark, ruthless mask of the Mafia boss completely fracturing. The raw, desperate hunger in his eyes was still there, but now it was tainted with absolute guilt. "I knew," Charles confessed, his voice a low, heavy rumble that shattered my heart into a million jagged pieces. "Reyes has been hunting you for 3 years, Maya. The only way to keep you safe was to pull you into my world. I engineered the shootout in your district. I made sure I was the one who ended up on your operating table." I took a step back, my hands flying to my mouth as a wave of pure nausea washed over me. He hadn't just invaded my life. He had engineered my destruction just to claim me. I wasn't his savior, I was his captive, caught in a carefully constructed web. Before Charles could reach for me, the heavy oak doors of the foyer burst open. A dozen heavily armed men flooded the room, their weapons instantly raised and locked onto Charles and Marco. They weren't cartel soldiers. They were Charles's own men, the traitors Jauline had bought from the inside. "Take their weapons," Jauline commanded, her smile turning entirely lethal, "and lock my husband and his new pet in the West Wing. I have a phone call to make to Reyes." The heavy steel deadbolt of the West Wing bedroom echoed with a terrifying finality. We were locked inside a gilded cage. The sprawling suite was luxurious, heavily reinforced, and entirely inescapable. Charles stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the darkening estate. He looked like a caged predator, his massive frame radiating a dark, volatile fury. But I didn't care about his anger. I was drowning in my own. "You used me," I whispered, sitting on the edge of the velvet armchair, my arms wrapped tightly around my chest. "Everything, the kiss, the promises, it was all just manipulation to get me to trust you." Charles turned around sharply, ignoring the searing pain in his torn abdomen. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees directly in front of me. He reached out, his thick, calloused hands gripping my thighs to keep me from pulling away. "The ambush was planned. The clinic was planned," Charles rasped. his dark eyes burning with a desperate, intense fire as he looked up at me. But what happened between us on the mountain? That was real, Maya. I have watched you for a year, but I didn't realize keeping the truth will hurt you. I did it to protect you from Reyes. You did it to own me, I shouted, the tears finally spilling hot and furious down my cheeks. Before he could answer, the heavy door clicked unlocked. Charles was on his feet in a fraction of a second, shoving me behind his broad back as the door swung open. Jauline stepped into the room alone. She had dismissed her guards to the hallway. In her manicured hand, she held a sleek, silver, suppressed pistol. She didn't aim it at Charles. Instead, she walked to the polished mahogany desk and set the weapon down. Family bylaws dictate that a wife cannot spill her husband's blood without forfeiting all assets, Jauline said smoothly, and her dark eyes locking onto mine. But you aren't family, Maya. You're just a casualty of his obsession. Charles let out a low, lethal growl, taking a step toward her. If you touch her, Jauline, I will tear you apart with my bare hands. I'm not going to touch her, Jauline smiled, stepping back toward the door. She looked directly at me. I am giving you a choice, Doctor. He ruined your life. He dragged you into a war you didn't ask for. Take that gun, put a bullet in his chest. The moment his heart stops, I will hand you a forged passport, $5 million in untraceable crypto, and an escort to an airstrip. You can disappear forever. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out, the heavy door locking firmly behind her. The silver pistol felt impossibly heavy on the polished mahogany desk. I stared at it, at the metallic sheen reflecting the dim light of the West Wing bedroom. $5 million, a new identity, total freedom. The offer Jauline had laid out was a lifeline, but the cost was pulling the trigger on the man who had completely hijacked my soul. Before I could reach out and touch the weapon, the heavy steel door clicked unlocked again. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jauline stepped back into the room, entirely alone. She had traded her crimson dress for a flowing dark silk robe that swept across the hardwood floor. She wasn't holding a weapon this time. Instead, she carried 2 crystal glasses and a half-empty bottle of expensive red wine. She scat me to join her for a drink. I see you haven't made your decision yet, Jauline noted smoothly, her eyes darting to the untouched gun on the desk. As she walked over to the small sitting area, pouring the dark liquid into the glasses. I understand. Taking a life is a heavy burden for someone sworn to save them. What do you want, Jauline? I asked, my voice tight and defensive. I didn't move from my spot. She offered me a glass, her dark eyes flashing with a strange, melancholic understanding. I want you to know exactly who you are protecting, Maya. Because looking at you right now, I see myself. I know exactly how intoxicating his gravity is. I know what it feels like to believe you are the only one who can tame the monster. I refused the wine, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. You don't know anything about me. I know he saved you, Jauline countered softly, taking a slow sip from her crystal glass. Just like he saved me, 5 years ago, my father's syndicate was wiped out in a bloody turf war. I was trapped in a burning convoy, bleeding out from a piece of shrapnel in my shoulder. Charles pulled me from the wreckage. He carried me out of the fire, patched me up, and hid me away. He was my absolute hero, Maya. The love between us was a consuming, brilliant fire that burned brighter than anything I had ever known. Her voice cracked slightly, the cold, calculating Mafia queen fading for just a fraction of a second to reveal a deeply broken woman. She walked over to the massive window, staring out at the dark estate. We were married within 6 months, Jauline whispered, a bitter smile touching her lips. I wanted nothing more than to give him an heir, to build a dynasty with the man who saved my life. But the months turned into years, and the nursery remained completely empty. I subjected my body to endless treatments, endless failures, and as my womb proved barren, the fire between us turned to ice. He stopped looking at me, and eventually, he stopped touching me altogether. I swallowed hard, the sheer vulnerability of her story hitting me in the chest. Despite the fact that she had brought a cartel into this house, I could feel the agonizing weight of her rejection. But that wasn't what broke us, Jauline continued, turning back to face me, her dark eyes hardening into pure obsidian. He found someone else to play the hero for. Another girl, a young, terrified runaway caught in the crossfire of the South Side docks. He brought her here, He put her in a guest room, and then he put her in his bed. The words struck me like a physical blow. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "I caught them, Maya," Jauline rasped, her knuckles turning white around her wine glass. "In the very house I was supposed to be the queen of." He shattered my heart, and in its place, he left a cold, ruthless void. I swore to myself that night that I would take everything from him. His empire, his throne, his life. I would make him bleed exactly how he made me bleed. She walked over to the desk, her manicured finger lightly tapping the cold steel of the silver pistol. "He collects broken things, Maya. He fixes them, he uses them, and then he discards them. Don't be another discarded toy in his collection. Be the woman who finally ends his reign." The heavy psychological warfare Jauline had waged left me completely paralyzed. When Charles finally came to the West Wing later that night, the exhaustion and the lingering pain of his torn sutures made him look incredibly fragile. The Mafia king was cracking. He didn't ask for permission. He crossed the room, pulling me into a desperate, crushing embrace. His massive hands tangled in my hair, his lips pressing feverishly against my temple. I tried to stay rigid, tried to hold on to the anger of his manipulation, but the sheer, overwhelming heat of his body melted my defenses. "I'm sorry," Charles whispered roughly against my skin, his voice vibrating with a raw, agonizing sincerity. "I brought you into a nightmare, but you are the only real thing in this entire, God-forsaken world, Maya. You aren't just a collection to me. You are my absolute salvation." I looked up into his dark, desperate eyes, and the final wall around my heart crumbled. The tension that had been building between us since the mountain house finally boiled over into a chaotic, undeniable collision. He kissed me, a deep, bruising possession that tasted of apology and sheer need. I kissed him back, pulling his black t-shirt over his head, my hands tracing the dark ink of his tattoos and the thick bandages wrapping his waist. We collapsed onto the massive four-poster bed, lost in a desperate tangle of heat and urgency. I gave myself to him completely, letting the dangerous, lethal Mafia boss brand my soul, believing in that fleeting moment that I was truly the exception to his dark rules. But the illusion of our love was entirely fragile, completely shattered less than 48 hours later. It was deep in the middle of the night. I had woken up processing what Jauline just told me. But my body was still thrumming with the aftershocks of his touch, but my mind was a chaotic, terrifying war zone. Jauline's words played on an endless loop in my head. He collects broken things. He fixes them, uses them, and discards them. I couldn't just lie there. The walls of the gilded cage felt like they were closing in on me. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, wrapping a dark silk robe tightly around my waist. The hardwood floor sent a freezing shock up my bare legs as I stepped out into the cavernous, unlit hallways of the estate. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a glass of water, maybe reassurance. But as I navigated the maze of the mansion, I saw a faint sliver of amber light bleeding from beneath the heavy oak doors of the master suite, Jauline's room. My heart stalled in my chest, a cold and creeping dread wrapped around my throat, making it impossible to breathe. I crept closer, the thick Persian rugs completely masking my footsteps. The door was cracked open, just a fraction of an inch. "I destroyed us, Jauline." Charles's low, gravelly voice drifted through the gap. He didn't sound like a ruthless Mafia king. He sounded heavy with an exhaustion and guilt I had never heard from him before. "I took the love we had, and I poisoned it. I am so damn sorry for what I did to you." "Apologies don't rewrite history, Charles," Jauline murmured, her voice stripped of its venom, sounding entirely broken. I peered through the narrow crack, the breath violently catching in my throat. Charles was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. Jauline was standing between his knees, her hands gently framing his jaw. She leaned down, pressing her lips softly to his. He didn't pull away. He didn't stop her. Instead, with a heavy, defeated groan, his massive hand slid up her waist, pulling her down onto the bed with him. The physical pain that ripped through my chest was absolute torture. It felt like a jagged knife twisting directly into my ribs. The air was violently sucked from my lungs. I watched the man who had just claimed me, the man who had made love to me as if I were the absolute center of his universe, fall right back into the toxic, consuming gravity of his wife. I didn't scream, I didn't push the door open and demand an explanation. I backed away into the shadows, a hot, silent tear slipping down my cheek. The cold realization set in with absolute, terrifying clarity. Jauline was entirely right. And I wasn't his salvation. I was just another toy in his collection. A temporary distraction he used to nurse his physical wounds while his wife nursed his psychological ones. I lay awake in the suffocating darkness of the West Wing, my mind replaying the devastating scene I had just witnessed. Charles's hand sliding up Jauline's waist, her lips pressed against his. The man who had just claimed me, who had branded my soul with his touch less than hours ago, was in the arms of his wife. I didn't cry anymore. The tears had completely dried up, leaving behind a barren, toxic wasteland in my chest. I had sacrificed everything for him. I had abandoned my clinic, risked cartel execution, and stitched his broken body back together, only to realize I was nothing but a pawn. I wasn't his salvation. I was a temporary bandage for a mafia boss who was still deeply entangled in the toxic, magnetic pull of the woman he had married. As the gray light of dawn finally began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the terrified doctor inside me died completely. In her place, something dark, ruthless, and violently angry woke up. I sat up, my eyes locking onto the polished mahogany desk. The silver suppressed pistol Jauline had left for me was still sitting there, catching the pale morning light. I wasn't plotting an escape anymore. I wasn't thinking about the $5 million or the forged passport. I was thinking about blood. I wanted him to feel the exact agonizing tear in his chest that he had just inflicted on mine. I was going to kill Charles, for real. The heavy steel door clicked unlocked, now pulling me out of my dark thoughts. Jauline walked into the room. She was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit today, but the triumphant, untouchable glow she usually carried was completely missing. She closed the door and leaned heavily against the wood, letting out a ragged, exhausted breath. For a moment, the Mafia queen looked entirely fragile. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "I made a mistake," Jauline whispered, her voice tight with a bitter, self-loathing anger. She wasn't looking at me. She was talking to herself, fighting a war inside her own head. "I let him touch me last night." I looked into his eyes, and I felt all that ridiculous, pathetic history rushing back. For one stupid second, I actually thought we could fix the ruin we made of each other. She stopped pacing, and her dark eyes snapping up to the ceiling as she fought to compose herself, her jaw clenched tight. "But I refuse to be weak," Jauline declared, her voice hardening back into pure steel. She turned to face me, the ruthless ambition burning away her momentary vulnerability. "He broke my heart. He humiliated me. He completely discarded me for a younger, shinier toy. I cannot let nostalgia distract me from what needs to be done. He has to pay for the suffering he put me through. I will take his empire, and I will take his life." She walked over to the desk, her manicured fingers brushing the cold metal of the silver pistol. She turned her dark, calculating gaze onto me, taking in the cold, dead expression on my face. She could see that the illusion had shattered. "I can't pull the trigger myself. Yet the family bylaws would strip me of the assets if my hands are dirty," Jauline said softly, her eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "But you have every reason to want him in the ground. He dragged you into hell, Maya." She picked up the gun and held it out toward me, the heavy silencer catching the light. "I need to know right now," Jauline demanded, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Have you made up your mind? Are you going to kill him?" I stared at the weapon in Jauline's outstretched hand. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a tool of absolute permanent destruction. I slowly reached out, wrapping my pale, trembling fingers around the sleek grip. The metal was heavy and freezing against my palm. I had spent years of my life inside operating rooms, holding scalpels with surgical precision, fighting the grip of death to keep people breathing. Taking a life went against every single vow I had ever taken. But as my finger brushed the cold curve of the trigger, a rush of dark adrenaline flooded my veins. Charles had turned me into a weapon. He had taught me how to hold a gun in the Glass Mountain house. He had told me to be ruthless. "I've made my decision," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of emotion as I lowered the barrel. I didn't say another word to Jauline, The cold, burning desire for revenge had entirely consumed me. I was going to look him straight in the eyes, let him see exactly what he had created, and I was going to pull the trigger. Across the sprawling estate in the heavily fortified primary study, Charles sat behind a massive oak desk. The room was shrouded in shadows, and the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight. He poured 2 fingers of amber bourbon into a crystal glass, but he didn't drink it. He stared blankly at the liquid, his massive chest rising and falling in slow, agonizing breaths. The physical pain from his torn sutures was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological torture tearing his mind apart. The Mafia King was playing an incredibly dangerous, impossible game, and the board was completely catching fire. He let out a low, rough groan, leaning back in the leather chair and pressing the heels of his hands against his tired eyes. The memory of the previous night was suffocating him. He had gone to Jauline's room to apologize, to finally close the door on their toxic, destructive history. But when she had touched him, when he looked into the eyes of the woman he had built his entire empire with, the old fire had flared back to life. He still loved his wife. He hated himself for it. He hated the blood and betrayal between them. But the deep, foundational love forged in the fires of their youth was undeniable. And yet, the moment he had left Jauline's bed, his chest had seized with a desperate, frantic panic. His mind had immediately violently snapped back to Maya, the innocent, fierce doctor who had refused to let him die, the woman who had thrown a cartel tracker into the ocean without blinking. When he thought of Maya, he didn't feel the heavy, toxic weight of his criminal past. He felt salvation. He felt a pure, consuming love that made him want to burn his entire life to the ground just to keep her safe. He loved them both. Charles gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning bone white. He was a man who demanded absolute control, a man who commanded thousands of soldiers and navigated cartel wars without a single drop of sweat. But right now, he was completely paralyzed. He knew Jauline still loved him, despite the coup, despite the anger. He could feel it when she kissed him. And he knew Maya had fallen for him, completely surrendering her soul to him in the West Wing. But he had lied to both of them. He was holding 2 queens, stringing them along in a web of manipulation and possessive obsession. He didn't know how to choose. He didn't know how to let either of them go without tearing his own heart out. Charles finally picked up the glass of bourbon, downing the burning liquid in one swallow. He stared at the locked door of his study, unaware that the game he was playing had already spiraled completely out of his control. He didn't know that his wife was plotting a hostile takeover, and he had absolutely no idea that the terrified doctor he had sworn to protect was currently walking down the hallway, a loaded, suppressed pistol gripped tightly in her hand, coming to end his life soon. It took me 1 month to finally get the courage to kill Charles and go far away from all this toxic world. The hallway leading to the primary study felt miles long. Every step I took against the thick Persian runner was completely silent, but inside my head, a deafening, chaotic roar threatened to consume me. The heavy silver pistol weighed down my right hand. My knuckles were white, my grip locked in a death spiral. I had spent my entire adult life studying how the human heart worked, and how to keep it beating against all odds. Now I was walking down a dark corridor to deliberately stop one. I reached the heavy oak doors of the study. I didn't knock. I didn't hesitate. I pressed my free hand against the polished wood and pushed the doors open. The room was shrouded in shadows, smelling heavily of aged bourbon and old paper. Charles was sitting behind the massive desk. He looked up, the exhaustion carved deep into the sharp lines of his face. For a fraction of a second, his dark eyes lit up with a desperate, heavy relief at the sight of me. Then his gaze dropped to my right hand. He saw the suppressed pistol. The relief vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, terrifying realization. The Mafia King didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He didn't dive for cover. He sat perfectly still, and his massive hands resting flat on the mahogany desk, entirely surrendering to the judgment standing in his doorway. "I saw you," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the study like a serrated blade. I raised the gun, leveling the barrel directly at the center of his chest. "Last night, I went to her room. I saw you touching her, kissing her." Charles's breath hitched. A brutal spasm of raw pain crossed his features. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands entirely visible, his broad chest completely exposed to my aim. "Maya," Charles rasped, his voice breaking under the weight of his own guilt. "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," I screamed, the cold, dead anger finally fracturing into absolute heartbreak. "You told me I was your salvation. You took my body. You took my trust. And then you walked straight down the hall into the bed of the woman who just tried to have you murdered. You are a monster, Charles. You collect people just to see how completely you can break them." He took a slow step around the desk, ignoring the gun pointed at his heart. "I didn't want to hurt you. God, Maya, breaking you is the last thing I ever wanted to do. Then why did you do it?" I demanded, my finger trembling against the trigger. Charles stopped a few feet away from me. The ruthless, untouchable aura of the cartel boss was entirely stripped away, leaving only a deeply conflicted, paralyzed man. "Because I am tearing myself apart," Charles confessed, the brutal honesty vibrating in the quiet room. I looked at her and I saw a decade of history. I saw the woman I built this empire with. I still love her, Maya. But when I look at you, I see the only light I have left. I love you too. I love you both, and I don't know how to rip either of you out of my soul without bleeding to death. The words were meant to be a confession, but they hit me like a slap to the face. He loved us both. He was playing a sick, twisted game, keeping us both on a string to feed his own massive, selfish gravity. "You don't know what love is," I whispered, my grip on the gun tightening. "You only know possession, and I refuse to be owned by you anymore." Before I could pull the trigger, the heavy oak doors clicked open behind me. Such a beautiful, tragic speech. Jauline's smooth velvet voice echoed through the study. I didn't lower the gun, but I stepped to the side, keeping both Charles and his wife in my peripheral vision. Jauline walked into the room, now dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit. She moved with the predatory grace of a queen, stepping onto a conquered battlefield. Charles's eyes narrowed, a lethal, dangerous darkness immediately returning to his gaze as he looked at his wife. "You gave her the gun. You're trying to make her do your dirty work so you don't forfeit the family assets." "I am simply giving the doctor the closure you denied her," Jauline replied, stopping a few feet away from me. She looked at Charles, her dark eyes flashing with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "You played us both, Charles. You thought you could keep me as your tragic queen and her as your shiny new secret. But your reign is over. I am taking the empire back." "You can't hold the families together, Jauline," Charles growled, his jaw clenching. "The second I am dead, Reyes will slaughter you." Jauline let out a dark, melodic laugh. She tilted her head, a sickeningly triumphant smile spreading across her lips. "That is where you are wrong, my love. The families will fall perfectly in line, because I am carrying the one thing they respect more than violence." The air in the room suddenly turned entirely to ice. Charles froze, his massive frame locking in absolute stillness. Jauline took a step closer to her husband, her eyes gleaming with the ultimate, devastating victory. She placed her perfectly manicured hand flat against her stomach. "I am pregnant, Charles," Jauline announced, the words dropping like a live grenade into the center of the room. "After all these years of failure, I am carrying your legitimate heir." Charles stopped breathing. All the color violently drained from his face. Yet the Mafia king who had survived bullets, betrayals, and cartel ambushes looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His eyes dropped to her stomach, his mouth opening, but absolutely no sound came out. A child. The one thing he had desperately wanted. The one thing that had broken their marriage in the first place, was now a reality. My hands began to shake violently. The silver pistol suddenly felt like 1,000 pounds of dead weight. I stared at Jauline, then at Charles. I had come to this room to kill a monster. I had come to take my revenge on a man who had manipulated my soul. But looking at the gun in my hand, the terrifying reality crashed over me. If I pulled the trigger now, I wasn't just killing a mafia boss. I was murdering a father. I was taking a child's parent away before it was even born. And I was becoming the exact same kind of monster that I had spent my entire life trying to run away from. "Maya," Jauline commanded softly, her eyes entirely ruthless as she looked at me. "Finish it. Pull the trigger and you can walk away." Charles finally dragged his gaze away from Jauline's stomach, looking directly at the barrel of my gun. He didn't beg. He didn't try to defend himself. He just waited, his dark eyes completely shattered, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. For 30 horrifying days, I had lived as a ghost inside the sprawling estate. A full month had passed since the night I watched Charles and Jauline in the master suite. 30 days of cold, suffocating silence. 30 days of Charles watching me from across the room with broken, desperate eyes, knowing he had completely destroyed my trust. And I had spent an entire month warring with my own soul, plotting, hurting, and slowly letting the betrayal harden into absolute ice. And now, armed with the undeniable truth of Jauline's pregnancy, the month-long internal battle was finally over. A hot tear slipped down my cheek, breaking the month-long drought of my grief. I can't, I choked out, my voice cracking completely. I lowered the gun, the heavy barrel aiming at the Persian rug. I'm not a monster, Charles. I'm not going to leave a child without a father. I walked out of the room and immediately Jauline followed me and was calling my name at the hallway. And I stood with tears I couldn't hold back, and Jauline reached out to me to hug me passionately, whispering, I knew you wouldn't. A woman who risks her life to stitch up strangers in a basement doesn't murder the man she loves in cold blood. I needed to break him, but I never actually wanted him dead. You aren't weak, Maya, Jauline countered softly, taking a slow step toward me. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently catching my wrist to stop me from turning away. You're the strongest person in this entire house. I never actually wanted you to pull the trigger. It was a test, and it was a punishment. I pulled my arm back, completely confused. A punishment for who? For him, Jauline confessed, a bitter, tragic smile touching her lips. She looked toward the door, her voice dropping to a raw whisper, so Charles couldn't possibly hear her from the other side of the estate. For 30 days, I let my husband believe his empire was crumbling. I let him believe the woman he fell in love with was plotting his murder, and that his wife had handed him over to his worst enemy. I needed him to feel the exact suffocating terror of losing everything. The same terror he made me feel when he brought you into our home and replaced me. My breath hitched. The entire narrative violently flipped upside down. You didn't betray him? I lied to Reyes, Jauline admitted, a flash of her lethal brilliance returning to her eyes. Reyes destroyed my family years ago, Maya. Did you really think I would hand him the keys to my kingdom? I have been playing him for a month. I made the cartel think I was blinded by jealousy. I told Reyes that Charles was disarmed, broken, and waiting for execution. She took a shaky breath, the reality of her dangerous game finally crashing down on her. Reyes isn't sending scouts, Maya. He's coming here tonight, himself, with his elite guard to claim Charles's head, Jauline said, the terrifying truth dropping like a live grenade into the quiet bedroom. Charles still thinks I'm a traitor. He thinks he's going to die tonight, but I set a trap to wipe out the Reyes Cartel once and for all. The air in the room turned completely to ice. A month of tension and heartbreak instantly vaporized, replaced by the terrifying, imminent threat of an all-out war right on the mansion's front steps. Jauline took another step closer, at the proud Mafia queen, completely stripping away her ego. She reached out and gently took both of my trembling hands in hers. I am so sorry I used you, Jauline begged, her dark eyes entirely sincere. A tear finally spilled over her lashes. I let my heartbreak turn me into a monster. I manipulated your pain just to break Charles's ego. But right now, I am just a mother trying to protect her unborn child. If Reyes breaches those doors and our trap fails, he will slaughter us all. She tightened her grip on my hands, her voice dropping to a desperate, urgent plea. I know my husband broke your heart, Jauline whispered, looking at me woman to woman with absolutely zero pretense. But you are the smartest, bravest woman I have ever met. Please, Maya, don't take the flight out of the city. Stay here. Fight with me. Now help me kill the man who ruined your life 3 years ago so my child doesn't grow up without a father. I stared into Jauline's tear-filled eyes, the heavy silence of the bedroom pressing in on us. For 3 years, the Reyes Cartel had been the monster under my bed. They had slaughtered my colleagues, burned my hospital, and forced me into a life of paranoid hiding. I had taken a medical oath to do no harm, but looking at the desperate mother standing in front of me, I realized that sometimes, to excise a deadly cancer, you have to cut deep. I'll stay, I whispered, my voice completely steady. I reached down and picked up the silver pistol from the velvet chair, gripping it tightly. "Tell me exactly what we need to do." A fierce, brilliant light ignited in Jauline's dark eyes. Before she could answer, a vibrating rumble of armored vehicles echoed through the estate grounds. The floorboards beneath our feet literally shook. "He's here," Jauline breathed, her posture instantly straightening as the vulnerable mother vanished, entirely replaced by the ruthless Mafia queen. She looked at the gun in my hand. "Hide on the second-floor mezzanine. Keep to the shadows. Do not shoot until I spring the trap. Charles thinks he is walking into his own execution. We need Reyes to believe it too." I nodded, my heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs. I slipped out of the room, racing down the darkened hallways until I reached the sweeping balcony that overlooked the grand foyer. I crouched behind the thick marble balustrade, practically holding my breath. Below me, the massive double doors of the mansion were violently kicked open. The freezing night air poured into the foyer, followed immediately by a dozen heavily armed cartel soldiers in tactical gear. And then, stepping through the center of the formation, was Hector Reyes. He was an imposing, brutal-looking man, with a jagged scar running down his neck. He walked into the marble foyer like he already owned it. A sickeningly arrogant smile plastered across his face. Charles was standing at the base of the grand staircase. He didn't have his weapon drawn. Marco stood to his left, his jaw clenched tight, ready to die beside his boss. Charles looked pale, exhausted, and entirely defeated. He believed his wife had sold him out. He believed this was his final stand. "Well, look at the great king of the Narrows," Reyes sneered, at his heavy boots echoing loudly against the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away from Charles, looking him up and down. "I heard you took a bullet in a dirty alleyway. It's a shame you didn't bleed out in the trash where you belong. It would have saved me the trip." "If you came to kill me, Reyes, get it over with," Charles growled, his deep voice radiating a dark, defiant power despite his physical weakness. "But if you think my men will ever bow to a street dog like you, you're dead wrong." "Your men?" Reyes laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Your men answer to your wife now." Right on cue, Jauline slowly descended the marble staircase. She moved with absolute, terrifying grace, her dark eyes completely unreadable. The cartel soldiers parted slightly to let her step onto the main floor. Charles stared at her, the heartbreak and betrayal painfully visible in his dark eyes. He didn't say a word to her. He just braced himself for the end. Jauline, Reyes smiled, opening his arms slightly. "You delivered exactly as promised. The estate is mine, the port is mine, and the king is disarmed. The Reyes Cartel thanks you for your service." "You're very welcome, Hector," Jauline purred, stopping directly between Charles and the cartel boss. She slowly reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. Reyes smirked, expecting her to hand over the digital ledger keys to the Empire. Instead, Jauline pulled out a sleek black handgun, turning on her heel with lightning speed. She didn't aim at Charles. She pressed the barrel directly under Reyes's chin. "But did you really think," Jauline hissed, her voice dropping to a demonic, lethal whisper, "oh, that I would ever hand my husband's throne to the man who murdered my father?" Reyes's eyes widened in absolute shock. "Kill them!" Jauline screamed. The foyer instantly exploded into absolute chaos. The traitorous guards flanking the room, who Reyes thought Jauline had bought for him, suddenly raised their rifles and opened fire on the cartel soldiers. The deafening roar of gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers above. Glass rained down like deadly snow. Charles, reacting with pure, violent instinct, grabbed Jauline by the waist and threw them both behind a massive marble pillar just as a hail of bullets ripped through the space where they had been standing. Marco unleashed a devastating volley from his shotgun, dropping 2 cartel men in seconds. From my spot on the mezzanine, the air was thick with gray smoke and the sharp smell of cordite. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the silver pistol. I watched in absolute terror as Charles, despite his torn abdomen and massive blood loss, fought like a demon to protect the wife he thought had betrayed him just seconds ago. But there were too many of them. Reyes's elite guard was highly trained. They quickly took cover behind the heavy oak entry tables, laying down a suppressing fire that completely pinned Charles, Jauline, and Marco behind the pillars. Through the thick smoke, I saw Reyes. He had managed to roll away from Jauline's initial trap. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. He pulled a heavy assault rifle from a fallen soldier. He didn't aim at the guards. He was moving flanking right, and using the crossfire as cover, walking perfectly into Charles's blind spot. Charles was busy reloading, his massive body shielding Jauline. He didn't see Reyes closing in. My heart stalled. Time completely slowed down. 3 years ago, I had hidden under a desk while this man slaughtered my friends. Tonight, he was going to slaughter the man I loved. Keep both eyes open, Charles's deep, steady voice echoed in my memory from the glass mountain house. Don't look at the target. Look at the front sight. Squeeze the trigger. I stood up, stepping out from behind the safety of the marble balustrade. I raised the silver pistol, gripping it with both hands, planting my feet firmly on the mezzanine floor. Reyes raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Charles's exposed back. I didn't hesitate. I didn't shake. And I aligned the metal dot with the center of the cartel boss's chest, and I squeezed the trigger. The suppressed pistol bucked in my hands. Reyes jerked violently as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He spun around, his eyes snapping up to the balcony in shock. He saw me standing there, a pale, terrified doctor who had finally evolved into a killer. He raised his rifle to shoot me. I squeezed the trigger a second time, then a third. The shots hit him dead center in the chest. Reyes's eyes rolled back into his head, his heavy assault rifle clattering uselessly to the marble floor. He collapsed backward, his body hitting the ground with a heavy final thud. The cartel boss who had haunted my nightmares for 3 years was dead. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining cartel soldiers broke formation, scrambling in a desperate panic toward the open doors. Marco and the estate guards ruthlessly cut them down before they could reach the courtyard. The deafening gunfire finally ceased, replaced by the heavy, ringing silence of the destroyed foyer. Smoke curled lazily toward the vaulted ceiling. The marble floors were slick with blood and shattered glass. I slowly lowered the silver pistol, my knees completely buckling. I collapsed onto the floor of the mezzanine, the gun slipping from my numb fingers. I had crossed the line. There was no going back to the basement clinic. There was no going back to the light. Below me, Charles stepped out from behind the marble pillar. He was covered in plaster dust and blood, his chest heaving as he stared down at Reyes's lifeless body. Slowly, Charles tilted his head back, his dark and exhausted eyes searching the shadowed balcony until they locked perfectly onto mine. The heavy, ringing silence of the grand foyer felt entirely surreal. I sat completely paralyzed on the cold marble floor of the mezzanine, the silver pistol resting inches from my trembling fingers. I stared down at Hector Reyes's lifeless body, my mind struggling to process the absolute finality of what I had just done. I had taken a life. The terrified, disgraced doctor was officially dead, buried under the smoke and shattered glass of a cartel war. Heavy, agonizing footsteps echoed on the sweeping marble staircase. I looked up. Charles was taking the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the searing pain in his torn abdomen, his massive frame covered in plaster dust and blood. He reached the top of the landing and dropped to his knees right in front of me. Yet he didn't look at the gun. He didn't look over the balcony at the carnage below. He grabbed my face with both of his large, calloused hands, his dark eyes frantically searching mine for any sign that my soul had completely shattered. "Maya," Charles breathed, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. He pulled me flush against his chest, burying his face into the curve of my neck. The sheer, overwhelming heat of his body enveloped me, anchoring me to the earth. "You shot him. God, you actually shot him for me." "I couldn't let him kill you," I whispered. My hands instinctively wrapping around his broad shoulders, my fingers tangling in his dark, dust-covered hair. The trembling finally stopped. Wrapped in his arms, surrounded by the absolute destruction of his world, I finally felt completely safe. Yet the soft click of high heels on the marble stairs pulled us apart. Charles kept one heavy arm securely wrapped around my waist, keeping me tucked against his side as we both looked up. Jauline stood at the top of the staircase. Her tailored suit was ruined, her hands were shaking slightly, but the terrifying, regal aura of the Mafia queen was fully intact. She looked down at the foyer, then back up at us. "You have a terrible habit of saving his life, Doctor," Jauline noted softly, a genuine, exhausted smile touching her lips. Charles stood up slowly, pulling me up with him. He looked at his wife, the the realization of her massive, lethal deception finally settling in. You risked everything, Jauline. You risked yourself, our unborn child, just to draw him out. I secured our child's future, Jauline corrected him, stepping closer. The bitter anger that had poisoned their marriage for years was entirely gone, washed away by the blood on the floor. The Reyes Cartel is decapitated. The remaining families will fall perfectly in line by morning. I took my revenge on the men who destroyed my father, Charles, and I made you realize exactly what it feels like to almost lose everything. I never wanted to kill you. I wanted you to suffer just the same I suffered catching you with that young girl on our bed. You broke me that night, Charles. She reached out, her manicured hand gently resting against Charles's blood-stained chest. It wasn't a possessive touch. It was a gesture of profound final closure. I will run the legitimate fronts of the syndicate, Jauline announced, her voice perfectly steady. I will manage the offshore accounts, the real estate, and I will raise the heir to this empire in absolute safety. I will be your partner in business, Charles, but I am not your wife anymore. Charles stared at her, a complex storm of grief, awe, and regret flashing through his dark eyes. Jauline, don't apologize, she interrupted softly. She didn't look back at me. She simply turned on her heel, walking back down the sweeping marble staircase with the absolute dignity of a queen who had just won her ultimate victory. Leaving us completely alone in the shadows of the mezzanine, Charles turned back to me. The Mafia king, who had just survived an absolute bloodbath, looked incredibly vulnerable. He reached down and picked up the silver pistol from the floor, popping the magazine out and clearing the chamber before tossing the useless weapon aside. The 5 million is still in the offshore account, Charles whispered, his large hands coming up to gently frame my face. His thumbs brushed across my cheekbones, his dark eyes pleading. The forged passport is in the desk downstairs. There is a private jet waiting on the tarmac, fueled and ready. I promise to give you your life back, Maya, but you don't have to take it. You can stay. I can give you the world. I looked up into his intense, consuming gaze. I thought about the quiet, hidden life in the basement clinic. I thought about the sterile, safe operating rooms of my past. Then I looked past his broad shoulders, watching Jauline disappear into the lower hallways. I finally understood the truth. Charles didn't love me the way he loved her. What we had was a brilliant, chaotic collision born of trauma, survival, and adrenaline. But Jauline was his foundation. She was his equal, his match, and the mother of his child. If I stayed, I would always be the outsider in a deeply complicated, unbreakable bond. I refused to spend the rest of my life as a consolation prize. I reached up, gently wrapping my fingers around his thick wrists, and pulled his hands away from my face. You don't need a doctor anymore, Charles, I whispered, my voice completely steady, completely at peace. And I don't want to be a mafia queen. I want my life back. Charles froze, the rejection hitting him harder than any bullet ever could. He searched my eyes for any sign of hesitation, but he found absolutely none. I was entirely done with the dark. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as he took a slow, agonizing step back, completely releasing his hold on me. The car is waiting outside, Charles rasped, his voice hollow and defeated. Marco will take you to the airstrip. You will never have to look over your shoulder again, Maya. You have my word. I didn't kiss him goodbye. I didn't look back. I walked down the marble staircase, stepping over the shattered glass and the ghosts of the cartel, and I walked straight out the heavy front doors into the freezing night, taking my absolute freedom.
2 weeks later, the sprawling estate in the Narrows was completely silent. The shattered chandeliers in the grand foyer had been replaced, the blood scrubbed from the marble, and the cartel threat permanently erased. The families had fallen perfectly into line. My empire was secure. But as I stood in the center of the primary study, staring out the velvet-draped windows into the dark courtyard, the throne had never felt so incredibly empty. For the first few days after Maya walked away, I felt the sharp sting of her absence. I mourned the loss of the fiery, brilliant doctor who had stitched my broken body back together. But as the adrenaline completely faded, and the quiet reality of my life set in, the phantom heat of that basement clinic evaporated entirely. I realized exactly what I had lost. It wasn't Maya. Maya was a fleeting escape, a beautiful, reckless distraction from the crushing weight of my own failures. But my heart, my soul, my absolute gravity, had never actually shifted. It had always belonged to the woman who stood between me and a cartel boss, the woman who engineered a flawless coup just to protect our unborn child. I turned away from the window. I walked out of the study, navigating the long, cavernous hallways of the estate until I reached the heavy oak doors of the master suite. I didn't barge in. I didn't demand entry like the king I was supposed to be. I raised my heavy, calloused fist and knocked softly on the wood. A moment later, the door clicked open. Jauline stood there, wearing a dark silk robe, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked at me, her expression guarded, a silent question in her deep, dark eyes. I looked at my wife. I saw the decade of history, the blood we had spilled together, the heartbreak, and the undeniable consuming fire that still burned beneath the ashes of our marriage. "The empire is secure," I said, my voice dropping to a low, raw rumble that vibrated in the quiet hallway. "The families are in line. The ledgers are clean." "I know," Jauline replied smoothly, keeping her chin high. "I reviewed the offshore transfers this morning." I took a slow step closer, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches away. I didn't reach for her. I stripped away every ounce of my pride, completely baring my soul to the only woman who had ever truly owned it. "I don't care about the empire, Jauline," I confessed, my eyes burning with an absolute desperate devotion. "I don't care about the throne, yet I spent the last 2 weeks realizing that a king is absolutely nothing without his equal." Her breath hitched slightly, the cold, untouchable armor she wore finally beginning to crack. "You said you were my partner, but not my wife," I whispered, lifting my heavy hand to gently, reverently frame the side of her face. My thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I am standing here right now, begging you to let me earn that title back. I want my wife back, Jauline. I want my family, and I will spend the rest of my miserable life proving to you that I am worthy of both." Jauline looked up into my eyes, searching for the lie, searching for the fleeting distraction. But she found only the absolute, undeniable truth of the man who had pulled her from a burning convoy 5 years ago. A slow, genuine smile finally touched her lips. She didn't say a word. She simply reached up, intertwining her manicured fingers with mine, and pulled me across the threshold, closing the heavy oak door completely behind us.